William, welcome to the show. Give us 60 seconds on your road to Texas A&M.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me on here. My route to Texas A&M was a little circuitous. I originally went to Princeton for college, where I studied international relations. Then I went to Italy, where I worked for 2 years for the Washington Post as a journalist. Then I went to law school at Harvard. Spent a couple years in New York working for a big law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell and their mergers and acquisitions group. Then came back and started teaching at Texas A&M now 4 years ago, and have been loving it. I'm loving every moment of it.
That's awesome. I listened to Dax Shepard's podcast, Armchair Expert. Our listeners are tired of hearing me say that because I listen to it so much that I talk about it all the time. And they made up a word, uniphiles, because they admire most of the schools you went to, like Princeton and Harvard, and they get really worked up when somebody on their show has been to one of those schools. But
well, I loved all of them. They were a wonderful education.
That's good. Yeah, you really went for it on the education thing there. That's great. So we have some kind of team building questions we ask on each show. Where did you grow up?
Austin, Texas.
All right.
Not too far away.
Yeah, but you did travel far for school.
Yes.
And then circled back around.
That's right. I always wanted to get back to the warmth of Texas.
Isn't it nice? Yeah, I don't know. Not too hot usually. Just a couple months there. How many siblings do you have, and where were you in the birth order?
So I'm the second of two.
Okay.
I have a sister, Martha, who lives in Mississippi and is currently in med school and also has two young kids. So
that's great.
Yep, it's a full family. I have one daughter.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What was your first job?
My first job was, well, it depends on, I guess, how you define job.
We've defined it very loosely.
Let's say the first time I got a job out of college was my job at the Washington Post. Although I moved to the Washington Post originally from a short internship at at the Associated Press in Rome. I'd studied Italian in college, and I always wanted to go over there and learn the language better and spend time sort of understanding Italy. And so I went over, I worked at the Associated Press, I did an internship there, and then spent about a year and a half working at the Washington Post afterwards.
That's super cool, and I want to ask you more questions about that, but I'm going to go back to what was your very first job? What was your very first way of making
Before
money?
that, I did a job, a demolition. I was a demolitionist
for
one of our neighborhood friends. We spent it. I thought it was going to involve more breaking down of houses than it actually was. It was mainly, laying down carpet and pulling up of carpet. So it wasn't quite as exciting as the name.
Not so many sledgehammers and a little more.
That's right.
All right.
That's right.
Okay, so the Associated Press job and then the Washington Post job. That sounds fascinating. What were some of the stories you covered that were most memorable?
Yeah, so this was a really exciting time to be in Italy. This was 2004 until 2006. So this was when Silvio Berlusconi was the prime minister. He was a very flamboyant head of state. Always interesting stories and controversies coming out from him. We also covered the Vatican conclave, which was a pretty amazing experience. I was running down to St. Peter's Square when they were announcing when the white smoke was coming up from the conclave. So those were some of the highlights of my time in Italy.
That is pretty awesome. How have you been? I assume you've been following the coronavirus in Italy and the developments there.
Yep. I was just actually speaking to a friend of mine who now lives in Texas, but is from Italy. We had met at the University of Padova, and his parents are in a zone that is quarantined. So they're staying in their houses. They're not able to go out. So it's a scary time. I hope they have it under control, and I'm sure they're going to be doing everything they can to stop it.
We have a friend from that area of Italy as well, and they were showing us pictures of the supermarkets there, which had been wiped out, much like a hurricane hitting here or something like that, where that was a big realization. It was a visual realization of what was happening there that seemed really sad. So. What was your greatest challenge as a child?
Oh, the greatest challenge. That's a tough question. My greatest challenge was probably living up to my sister, who is 2 years older than me. She was beautiful and popular and smart. And so having her to follow was it was a challenge. It was also wonderful to have somebody like her that I could look up to and follow around. And so it was more of an opportunity than a challenge, let's say. Sure.
And what did your parents do, and how did that impact your professional choices?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you asked that. So my dad is he just is now a retired professor from the University of Texas.
Okay.
He was the head of the Michener Center for Writers at UT. So he was a writer and also a teacher. And so I think that he inspired me that, love for books and writing and reading. And so now I'm following in those footsteps and teaching.
That's pretty amazing. Yeah, definitely some overlap there with what you're doing, not only as a professor, but then in writing. So you wrote the book Blockchain Democracy, Technology, Law, and the Rule of the Crowd. I got to read some of it, just as much as I could to prep for the interview, but it was fascinating. And your research and writing, and even some of your teaching, it sounds like, is focused on blockchain and a little bit on Bitcoin. It sounds like a little bit more on blockchain, but obviously those go hand in hand. One of our other guests, Travis Kling, early on in the show, talked about investing in cryptocurrency. So our listeners, most of them have probably heard some of that from that episode, but obviously those concepts are still quite nebulous to most people. Sounds like ghost things that people don't really understand. And certainly Travis was more focused on the investment side and not, you have more of a legal angle. So can you give us maybe the second grade version of what blockchain does and how blockchain and Bitcoin are related?
Sure. That's a good way to put it, as the second grade, maybe even the kindergarten version.
Let's do kindergarten. I like that.
So Bitcoin and blockchain. So blockchain is the technology that powers Bitcoin. So that's the first point to know. Bitcoin itself is a virtual currency. So it means that it is money that is just existing on the internet. Somebody asked me today, are there actually Bitcoin coins? You can make them up if you want, but that doesn't mean anything. What really matters is the fact that you have currency that is being maintained and is being recorded on the internet, on these copies of what's called the blockchain, which is basically a long document that contains histories of all the transactions where money currently exists. And so what you need to have if you want to have a Bitcoin is to have an address, basically a bank account, where your Bitcoin resides. And so that is the basic idea, is that it is a record of this currency, of where money exists, and it's handled by a decentralized network of computers operating all around the world.
And
I don't know if that's first grade.
That was a little. I think
that might be a little above kindergarten.
That was a little above kindergarten, but that's all right. Our listeners are very intelligent; they'll catch on. So, why is it called blockchain?
Blockchain. Okay, great. That's a good question. So it's called blockchain because the blockchain, it's a long history of all the transactions, and it turns out that those transactions are recorded in things that are called blocks, and so it is a chain of blocks. And so you can go and look at today's block, the last one that was added. And then you can track it back and see, okay, what happened? Where did these coins that currently reside in my bank account, where did they come from? And you can go back and you can go back and you can go back and you can actually go back and trace every Bitcoin from the time that it was first created by Satoshi Nakamoto. You can actually find the Genesis block where he issued himself his first coins. And you can track every coin and where it's been throughout the history of the coin.
And blockchain has a lot of other applications within companies. I am interviewing somebody in a couple of weeks who is using blockchain in the oil and gas sector from a supply chain perspective because of that tracking mechanism. Can you tell us more about how companies are using blockchain?
Sure. Yeah. So that's the other element. So there's basically two sectors here that blockchain is being used for. One is the cryptocurrency world. That's, Bitcoin, Ethereum, a bit, Litecoin, Monero, right? Cryptocurrencies. The other world is this world of smart contracts / decentralized record keeping. And so a couple ways in which that's been used, and it's been interesting to people, and that industries have invested in it. So why do you want to use blockchain? You might use blockchain in a scenario where you don't trust a central administrator, and instead you want to spread out power and decision-making and record-keeping to a group. So what are some industries that might be helpful? The common one that is bandied about a lot is the shipping industry. Turns out that whenever you are shipping goods from one country to another, there's a lot of steps and a lot of people who have to be involved in that process, right? The customs agent, the port official, the person who puts the stuff on the ship, the shipper, the person who takes the stuff off the ship, right? So all of these people have to be involved. And each one of those transactions involves record keeping, involves documents, involves signatures. And so that's very time consuming. It's hard to double check. It's hard to make sure that it's accurate. And the blockchain has thought, well, what if we just have one immutable record where everybody can gain access to it and look at it and trust that it's secure, then maybe we can cut costs and make it more efficient. So that's one area where blockchain is thought to be able to be used outside of the cryptocurrency world.
And what, from the security factor, is that just from the meticulous tracking that is also decentralized? What makes it more secure? What makes me more comfortable about that process?
Yeah, so there's two elements of the security. So one is, could some hacker go into the blockchain and change it? And so there, the security, what we're talking about is its use of cryptography to make sure that somebody hasn't gone in and fiddled with the numbers. Mm-hmm. And so they've used complicated cryptographical concepts to link and make sure that if anybody tampers with the document, the blockchain, that it's immediately recognizable to everybody, and so they can immediately reject it. So that's one element of it, right? Making sure that people don't go in and tamper. The other part, which is actually a little bit more difficult to solve, is how do we know that the person who is trying to make changes to the blockchain is who they think, who they claim to be? And that's harder, right? Because you don't know if somebody, let's say the port official goes on and says, "Yep, I got the right document, so we're good to go to send this shipment overseas." Well, you don't know on the face of it that really was the right person who did it. You don't know if the information that they're putting on there is real, because it depends on facts in the real world. And that's something that is not so easily solvable by blockchain. And there's been approaches to try to make it more solvable, but it is not infallible.
So in your book, and you kind of alluded to this a little bit, you say that blockchain allows us to, and this is a quote from your book, entrust our technological lives to a network of peers. And then summarizing a little bit, rather than a large corporation like Facebook, Google, Amazon, that are some of our technology providers. Tell us more about the democracy aspect of blockchain. And I think that also seems to relate to the rule of the crowd. So give us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so the title of the book is Blockchain Democracy, and there's two aspects of that. One is that I wanted to explore how blockchain is affecting our government, right? How are we and our regulators and our laws? And so that was one element of the reference to democracy. The other element of it is that blockchain itself attempts to encode democratic principles into its system. So the way the blockchain works, right, is you have this record that's immutable and secure, and it's recorded and maintained by a group of users and nodes across the world. The reason why this is democratic is that everybody who's running a node, in a way, is contributing to maintaining the system. So if everybody all of a sudden disagrees and says, you know what, we want to go a different direction, we want to change the way that our system works, we want to change the rules, they can do that if they can get enough people to agree with them. And then there's a whole subset of the cryptocurrency world that is dealing with what's called a fork, which is basically when the nodes, the community, disagrees. What happens when people disagree about the direction they want to go? And in that case, that can sometimes lead to what is known as a fork, which means all of a sudden a cryptocurrency that used to exist as one document now exists as two. There's a group of people who are saying, this is what we think the rule should be. And there's another group that says, this is what we think the rule should be. And they're actually existing in parallel.
Same currency, or it becomes two different currencies?
So it's two different currencies.
Yeah,
at that point, it's two different currencies, even though everything other than whatever their disagreement is the same. And in fact, everything that existed before the point of the fork is the same. The blockchain is, in a way, identical up to the point of the fork. And so that's what makes it so confusing. And it leads to really interesting legal consequences as a law professor, right? About what happens when somebody who owns Bitcoin all of a sudden now owns Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin Gold or some fork. Right?
So let's talk about some of those legal implications. What does the general population need to know about that from a legal perspective?
Okay, so a few things. So one is tax, and I'm not a tax expert. The first thing you learn as an M&A lawyer is to never opine about tax.
Yeah, that's I'm an auditor, and I never opine about tax.
So I'm not going to opine about tax,
Sure.
But I will say that people should know about the tax consequences, and there may be tax consequences.
Good luck with that, y'all.
Yes, so deal with that. The second question, which I think people want to is important to investors, and maybe is the most important question as a law professor, is what regulatory overlay applies to blockchain-based systems, in particular cryptocurrencies, right? So one of the most sort of remarkable phenomena of the last couple of years in this world is the initial coin offerings, where people create a new digital currency and then they go out and they try to issue it to the world. And so, right, so it's called initial coin offering, which of course makes reference to initial public offerings, where say, Apple goes public and sells all its shares to the public.
And is regulated by the SEC and all of that fun stuff.
Exactly. So in the securities regulations, they run for thousands and thousands of pages. So as you can imagine, anybody who's doing one of these ICOs does not want to be recognized as doing a securities offering. So they want to do everything they can to avoid securities regulation. And so many people, particularly in the beginning of this phenomenon, were saying, what I'm issuing right now is not, whatever you say, it's not a security, so I don't have to comply with the securities regulations. That position nowadays is pretty much untenable. The SEC has said, look, here's what we're going to look for in order to determine whether it's a security. And it looks like lots of the things that are currently being issued are securities. So the most important thing, I think, as an investor, you need to know is this a security? If it's a security, am I getting the right disclosures? Are these disclosures accurate? And are the people who are issuing them complying with the law?
So from a securities regulation perspective, what regulations have been put into place now that it's been established? These are securities. You should be looking for the proper disclosures. What regulations are there?
Sure. Yeah. So the basic obligation, right, is if you are issuing a security, then you need to either register it with the SEC or find an exemption. So common exemptions, right, are you're only issuing them to a few accredited investors, basically, sophisticated rich people or institutions, or maybe you're not distributing them widely. So that's the basic rule. One of the big questions is, whenever you're analyzing one of these cryptocurrencies that's being issued, is it's analyzed under something called the Howey test. It's this famous test under securities regulation that basically says if you are selling an investment of money in an enterprise with the expectation of profit based solely on the efforts of others, then it's a security. It's technically an investment contract, but that counts as a security. And so the question you need to ask whenever you're investing in one of these things or whenever you're creating them is, does it meet those prongs? And as you can imagine, the prongs were invented by the Supreme Court in 1917 in this Howey case. Right. So they don't really apply so perfectly well in a world of cryptocurrencies. One of the interesting developments in the industry is there's a cryptocurrency exchange called Coinbase, which is one of the biggest ones in the US. And it has started, because it's in the business of buying and selling these cryptocurrencies among the public, is that it has actually started a program where it rates cryptocurrencies based on the likelihood of them satisfying the Howey test, which is sort of amazing that you have actually, there is no 1 or 0. It's, we're going to rate them on 0 to 5 on how likely they're to be found a security. Because
you do or don't, as an investor, I do or don't want it to be classified as a security.
Well, so you probably do not want it to be, well, from the perspective of the person who's selling it, you do not want it to be security because it's going to be costing a lot of money.
Right.
From the perspective of the investor, you probably want it to be a security in the sense that means you're going to get more disclosure. But on the other hand, right, you're also interested in the value of the system. And so if the system's going to be distracted by spending all this money and time on a registration, then maybe you don't want it. So,
and I'm clearly looking for a unique investment that's not a stock, or I would just invest in the stock market if I'm going to Bitcoin.
Exactly. And one of the other developments in the area that could be a game changer, right, would be if they launch something called an exchange traded fund, an ETF that was based on digital currencies. That's another area where there's been a lot of investment, and it is thought that once you can get an exchange traded fund that's run by a reputable institution, then you can have really the majority or the public invest in these things.
Because there would be some risk balance within that portfolio. I mean, because these are fluctuating so much, it seems like even if you had a somewhat balanced portfolio, it would still be a pretty risky portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, so why would you want to invest in an ETF rather than just a cryptocurrency? I think that so one right would be just the balancing it. You've got access to more of them. maybe you want it as a hedge. Maybe you think that cryptocurrencies behave in a different way than other investment classes. But yeah, the other one is just purely ease. It's really hard to get many of these cryptocurrencies, right? You could go through a cryptocurrency exchange, but if you don't do that, then the only way that you can get Bitcoin is to mine your own Bitcoin, which requires you to download the software, run a mining farm, spend lots of electricity, right? So most average investors are not going to want to do that. So maybe an ETF would allow them to get into the industry in an easier way.
That's great. So what other laws apply to Bitcoin and who regulates them?
Sure. So another important area is criminal law, right? So where might criminal law come into play when you're talking about coin offering? So one, right, would just be pure fraud. If somebody's defrauding you, there is no cryptocurrency out there. That would be one. But another important one, right, is theft. There's a really serious concern here about the ability of hackers to come in and steal your cryptocurrency. There was a study that was done, I think it was last year, and it said that $3.5 billion were stolen of cryptocurrencies last year from exchanges and investors.
I didn't know that.
$3.5 billion. So that's a huge number. Yeah. Another stat is that there's a UN report that came out a couple of years ago that said that North Korea had stolen $2 billion of cryptocurrency from exchanges for the purpose of funding its nuclear program.
That's
right?
pretty serious. Yeah.
So this is criminal law. This is a national security law. Yeah. There's a lot of overlays here. And the real issue, right, is of course, if you're committing a crime, if you're stealing something, that's a violation of law. The problem is not so much finding out that there was a violation of law as enforcing it.
Well, and who, right? I mean, if I understand correctly, there's some anonymity with Bitcoin purchases. Even though you have the blockchain that's tracking it, you're not necessarily using your information, right? Or your true identity in buying that Bitcoin. So I would imagine that tracking the theft to the source would be really difficult.
Yes, that's right. So tracking, the basic idea is that in blockchain and Bitcoin, you are identified as not yourself, not by your name, but by your Bitcoin address, which is just a long, random set of numbers and letters. So you're not going to be able to identify who it was who perpetrated the theft just from your address.
And not attached to your IP address at all either? Or is there a link to that?
So there are ways that the FBI and the DOJ can track people down. It's not easy, and they are developing. There was a report recently that said that the FBI is surging its resources to go into analyzing and finding these kinds of cryptocurrency thefts. So there are ways to get around it, but they're not easy. And even if you do get around it, the other problem is that oftentimes, right, the hacker can go from anywhere. The hacker can be from any location. And so even if you do figure out who it is, well, if they're in their own country and that country doesn't cooperate with you, and most countries don't like to extradite their own citizens, then you're sort of out of luck. The person's got your money, you know who he is, but you can't get him.
I would imagine that the national security issue side of it makes it that much more of a pressing issue.
Yep. Yeah. The other element of the national security issue is that there's also a sort of different element, which is that people are, China in particular, are looking into creating national digital currencies. So there's something called the digital Yuan that has not yet been issued, but China says that they're about to issue it within this year. And the question then is, well, if this digital Yuan becomes sort of a worldwide phenomenon, or if it becomes widely accepted, how is the U.S. going to be able to regulate it and control it and to make sure that there are not sort of effects on the U.S. market?
That sounds difficult. Even from just a foreign currency exchange perspective, that sounds tricky.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, there are so many of these issues. And particularly, I mean, this is where a lot of the investment is coming from, actually, is from countries where citizens don't believe that their own national currency offers a good investment. Right. If you're living in a country that has hundreds and thousands of percent of inflation every year, right, like Venezuela, then you maybe don't want to stash all your savings in a bank account that is in Venezuelan bolivar. So maybe a cryptocurrency is a better way to get around that.
But then then you're subject to so much fluctuation in value there too. But at least it's not a known 1,000%
Yes, it's not an ideal. It's not an ideal investment, I don't think, but it is different from the other opportunities.
Right. Certainly gives you a hedge there. What impact, you talked a little bit about the national security issue, so that's interesting, but what impact do you anticipate blockchain and the cryptocurrencies will have on the government and vice versa?
Yeah, so people have been looking into whether or not you can use blockchain in government processes, most importantly in elections. Right, so there's a couple companies that have launched mobile phone-based election platforms where you can vote on your mobile phone, and then it all gets recorded on a blockchain. I should say, election security experts and computer science experts have been very leery of these systems because they worry that, look, even if it's a secure system on your mobile phone, maybe your mobile phone itself can be hacked into. Maybe you can get root access to the way that the cell phone is operating. And so there is deep concerns about how safe this is going to be, particularly from the perspective of cryptography, right? Where all this is based on, right? Blockchain is based on some computer code and particularly cryptography that hides and obscures information. Well, what if in the future we decrypt that? What if we break that cryptography? What if we break that encryption? Then all of a sudden you can go back and see where everybody voted or what they did when they interacted with the government. So there's some concerns about it, but at the same time, we also have some concerns about our current voting systems and our current voting machines. So that's part of what's driving this interest in it, which is that we have some serious concerns about how our voting systems work today.
Right. If it was working perfectly, we don't need to explore this, but it could give us an opportunity to improve the system at least, even if it's not perfect.
Exactly.
You documented the fascinating history of the blockchain and the inception, which you describe as online scribblings of a shadow figure named Satoshi Nakamoto. Tell me more about that. Give us kind of the 1-minute version of the history of blockchain and Bitcoin.
Sure. So in 1 minute, basically it all started in the 1990s when the internet was first developing. There was a group of computer scientists who were deeply concerned about what the internet would do to privacy and individual lives and the ability of the government to snoop on us. So they started looking for ways to get around this, and they thought that encryption, cryptography was the answer. They tried to create various digital currencies. They all failed until finally in 2009, Satoshi Nakamoto, who we don't know who he is, all we know is that he posts online.
And that is not his real name.
Likely not his real name.
Or her.
There was a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto. And they thought it was him, and then it was very clear it was not him.
poor real Satoshi is like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. So in 2009, he posted this white paper called Bitcoin, peer-to-peer electronic cash system that is the foundation for blockchain, and then it gets launched 2009, 2010, then it just takes off.
I didn't know about the nodes or the community that manages the kind of rules of the blockchain Bitcoin game. I had no idea that was how it was done.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting element of the blockchain system, and it shows you what a community it is. There's an interesting story. There's a professor at St. Mary's named Angela Walsh, who's a real expert on cryptocurrencies, and she's very active on Twitter. And so I think it was maybe yesterday actually that she posted on Twitter, well, what happens if, so there's a rule in the Bitcoin software that says you cannot issue more than 21 million Bitcoin. So once 21 million Bitcoin have been issued, that's a hard cap. No more Bitcoin will ever be issued ever again. So Angela Walsh put on her Twitter page, what if I submitted a proposal to the developers, the people who write the code? What if I submitted a proposal that said, let's raise that limit. Let's raise it to 42 million. What would happen? And so needless to say, because this is Twitter, it descended into total acrimony and anger and chaos. And everybody said, no, that's totally impossible. Or other people say, no, it's very easy. And then, so there was serious disagreement, but it shows you just that sort of what a vibrant community is. People have very strong opinions and they're always talking about it, and they were talking about their nodes, and it's a fascinating world.
And the coders, are they official, like, employees or representatives? Or are they, can anyone code?
Yes. So this is an interesting element of it. There are a group of developers that have what's called commit access to the Bitcoin core software. Bitcoin core software is a software that you can download from bitcoin.org, I believe. And it is the one that most people are, I presume almost everybody is using. That said, this is open source. Right. So if you wanted to go download that and then go change it around and then go send this new code with slight changes to it to a GitHub or something, you could do that. The question then would be, okay, you made this change. Is everybody in the community going to accept it? And if nobody accepts it, then it doesn't matter, right? What matters is you need to have everybody on the node network, everybody around the world, be running your software. Otherwise, whatever your changes are not going to make a difference in the network.
That's fascinating. Maybe a little scary, but fascinating.
Yeah,
but there certainly
really
is a control in place, right? That the whole community has to approve.
Yes.
Change.
Yeah. And that was sort of if there was a consensus that emerged from this Twitter war on Professor Walsh's Twitter page, it was that, well, what stops you ultimately is the community. If the community doesn't accept it, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah. What lessons can we draw from blockchain and Bitcoin about what happens when, and again, this is a quote from a description of your book, technology runs up against the stubborn realities of law, markets, and human nature?
Yes. So I would say that one of the big lessons from my experience researching this book and getting up to speed on how the blockchain network works and how it was created, why it was created, was that what we design in our code and our laboratory and on our computers, once it gets released into the world, it can change drastically. And if we don't plan for sort of the human nature and what's going to happen when it hits the market, then it will oftentimes lead to unexpected results. So you take what Satoshi was trying to do, and his writings, there's a lot of them, but his actual philosophy that he talks about is relatively slim. But when he talks about it, he says, look, I'm trying to create this utopia, this digital utopia where people are free from large corporations and the snooping of government. Well, what happens? Well, it's not a utopia, right? There's drug sales. There's talks about assassination markets. There's money laundering. There's the Russian KGB or FSB agents, the successor to the KGB, saying we're going to, like the Americans control the internet, we're going to control the blockchain. Right. So this is not a digital utopia, and it's not as decentralized as we thought it was going to be. Turns out there's all these market forces that push people to consolidate power, and turns out that there's a few miners in China who actually control a majority or close to a majority of the network. And so what Satoshi planned and predicted for did not end up panning out in reality.
I'd love to hear from him how that feels now, right?
So would I.
Yeah. So would many people, I'm sure. But how fascinating would that be to know how that feels, that this thing is so huge and now really out of his control.
Yeah. And I would say he did worry about some of these issues. He worried about people gaining control over the network. He worried about some of the bad uses that it would be put to. There was a period when WikiLeaks was being shut down in the financial system. And so a bunch of blockchain and Bitcoin enthusiasts said, well, we should use this as a way to promote Bitcoin and say, look, everybody give WikiLeaks money through Bitcoin. And Satoshi wrote back and said, no, this is not the right time. We should not be trying to encourage this kind of attention on our network because the government could shut it down.
Huh. And so has he spoken up more recently?
No. I don't remember exactly the year it was that he stopped, that he went dark, but it's been over 5 years.
Yeah. What has surprised you the most about the blockchain as you advance through your research?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I would say the most surprising fact was just how much these people who created it, Satoshi and the Cypherpunks who were sort of the initiators of the ideas, they really thought of themselves as philosophers. They had big ideas about how government worked, about how individual rights should be protected, and how we can go about implementing this balance. And so going back into these message boards and their emails and their websites, you see they write these little manifestos. There's Cypherpunk Manifesto, Crypto Anarchist Manifesto, and they really set out all these theories, many of which are in many ways prescient about the way the world is going. Right? They're very worried about the possibility that corporations are going to be using our data for profit. They're going to be snooping on us. They're going to be sharing this with the government, right? These are all the problems that we're dealing with today in our own world. So for me, it was sort of remarkable seeing this debate happening, almost 30 years ago.
And people would have thought they were crazy and that's never going to happen. No,
Yep.
Here we are.
Exactly.
Interesting. All right, let's jump into rapid fire. What do you consider your most valuable failure?
Losing the SBC championship basketball game my senior year of high school.
Oh, how was it valuable?
Well, it taught me the ability to overcome an absolutely devastating loss.
Yeah. And of course, getting into Princeton and Harvard, those were extremely valuable failures.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think is people's biggest misconception of you?
That I am primarily a law professor. I think I have a lot of other interests, and I hope to bring them, and I try to bring them into my law classes, my outside life. And I think that that's one misconception.
We hear that from a lot of the men that are guests on the show, that people think I'm only what I do for my work. That's interesting. If you could have anyone as a mentor for one day, who would it be?
Leo Tolstoy.
Oh, yeah? Why?
Because he's the greatest writer of all time, and I think he was also a very wise man.
So people say. Great. What is the most important advice you would give to yourself exactly 5 years ago?
Get into academia as soon as possible.
Yeah? Did you because you were at a firm before and then came into academia?
Yes, I was. And I've just loved being a teacher. I love teaching. I love writing. I love researching. And I just love the job. So
it's a good lifestyle, too. The autonomy is something that I think maybe people looking on the outside looking in don't necessarily recognize about, that you really get to pursue your interests most of the time.
Yep. Yeah. In the morning, I can be reading Plato. In the afternoon, I can be reading the Cypherpunk manifesto. And
then you get to write a book about it.
Exactly.
Who knows? Yeah. And they relate, right? If it's all about philosophy.
Yes.
A couple of great Tim Ferriss questions. What is the book you've given most often as a gift? Now, of course, it is Bitcoin democracy. I mean, blockchain. Now, of course, it is blockchain democracy. But what else
is it? The Very Hungry Caterpillar? Is that the one?
Oh, that's so good.
We've got a 2-year-old daughter at home, so many birthday parties are involved.
That's so cute. That's a good one. If you could have a billboard anywhere with anything on it, what would it say and why?
Probably a quote from Marcus Aurelius, which is that be good for something now while you still can. Don't think that you have 1,000 years to do it. Yeah,
that's a good one. It's really powerful.
Thank you.
What is your fondest memory of being connected with Texas A&M University?
To be honest, it's many memories. I think every day walking into class is just a wonderful memory. I mean, it's sometimes, going ahead, you can think, oh gosh, I've got all this reading to do. I've got all this work to do to prepare. And you walk in and you see all these great students. Hard to beat it.
It's a undescribable high, right?
Yeah,
being able to be in the classroom with students.
Yep.
We end each episode with Good Bull. This is an opportunity to recognize someone else for something great they have done. Do you have someone you'd like to send Good Bull?
To my colleague, Vanessa Casado Perez, who just had a baby daughter and is very busy and is a wonderful colleague.
That's awesome. Congratulations, Vanessa. Thanks for being on the show, William.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching. We appreciate your support. Drop us a like below and feel free to leave a comment if you wish. We appreciate positivity and constructive feedback. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on our latest episodes and bonus content. You can also take us on the road using your favorite podcast listening app. We have those linked below. If you'd like to know more about Mays Business School or our guests, visit mays.tamu.edu/podcasts. Talk with you soon.